right. Well, as I stated in my post that I made a couple days ago, I'm going to be walking us through some source criticism and gospel formation stuff. We're going to be looking at a lot of different things here today. And so buckle up. This video is probably going to be pretty long. And what I want to do in this video is I want to take a look at the traditional view of the Gospels and the sources for the Gospels, how we got them. I want to take a look at some of our reconstruction of how we've come about that through critical scholarship and historical critical methods. And there's a lot of different ways to look at that. I'm going to tell you kind of where I land on it, and I'm going to use a lot of sources here to kind of show you where we're at with it. The main source that I'm going to be using for a lot of the identification of how to view what scholars call Q is I'm going to be using some of the awesome introduction notes to the gospel from the New Oxford Annotated Bible. And they present a really good overview of historical critical methods and how that relates to gospel authorship, source criticism, that kind of stuff. I'm also going to be using and talking about this book here. I've talked about it before, but this is a book called The Case Against Q by Mark Goodacre. This book was put out in 2002, so this is not a new argument. This is Goodacre's argument is 23 years old at this point, and he's drawing on arguments by Farrer, that's even older, like 30 to 40 years more than that. So this is not a new idea that the critical scholarship view of Q and coming up with this like a saying source that helps figure out how we got what we do when we're looking at the Gospels and reconstructing it. And push back against that is not something new. This is something that's been talked about for a long time. It shaped a little bit of the conversation nowadays, because the consensus amongst most scholars, biblical scholars, especially critical scholars, for the past 200 years or so has been shaped through this idea of a sayings gospel or a saying source called Q. And so we'll talk about what all that means. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about first the traditional view of how we got our Gospels, who they're from, all that kind of stuff, what the church fathers had to say about it. And I'm drawing a lot of that from Eusebius's The History of the Church and what he had to say about what Papias said, Irenaeus said, Origen said, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll take a look at the two-source method. We'll take a look at the three-source method. We'll take a look at the four-source method as it relates to these hypotheses of how we have reconstructed where the Gospels came from, source material, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to talk about why maybe that's not the case, and then I'm going to share what I think about this also. Like I said, buckle up and get ready. I'm Sam, by the way. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 20 plus years. I am a Bible teacher, a biblical studies student. My training involves biblical studies. It involves biblical languages, theology, church history, that kind of stuff. So thanks for coming along this journey with me. If you haven't liked or subscribed yet, I would love for you to like the video. Would love for you to subscribe to my channel. And just kind of a heads up, I do this as by way of a hobby. I'm a full-time pastor, full-time student. And so I don't do YouTube full time, so just heads up on that, but would love for you to subscribe and would love for you to become a member if you would want to do that. Being a member gives you access to different classes that I have that are members only. So like things like Greek classes and that kind of stuff. So anyway, thanks for clicking on the video. This video, like I said in my post, I'm going to leave it on my channel for about a week, and then I'm going to recut it and put it in for members only. So if you're seeing this during the first week, then awesome. And after that, yeah, and I said this was kind of like a thank you to people who've been journeying with me for this year and a half or so already. But let's jump into it. Okay, so the traditional way of viewing gospel authorship, the sources behind the gospels, all that kind of stuff, comes to us through the church fathers. Okay, so each one of these gospels has a name attached to them. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the earliest full manuscripts we have, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Sinaiticus, all that kind of stuff, they have titles, and those titles are like according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have been called Synoptic Gospels, and they're called synoptic. It's because they have very similar layout. They're all trying to present in a chronological order the events and all that kind of stuff. John is different. John's not a synoptic, although he draws off his synoptic tradition and different things. But John is how can I put John? John's more of a mystical, like spiritual, and he has like a theme he's writing towards, and he's going to theme it out with 7 this and 7 that. Like you can kind of walk that through his gospel, and it's very thematic versus chronological, all that kind of stuff. But the synoptic gospels are more chronologically oriented, although I would maybe question that with Mark, but at least it has a trajectory of some kind of timeline. So early on in church history, there was this guy named Papias, and he was supposedly a student of the Apostle John. Papias lived anywhere between, I want to say, 60, 70, somewhere around there, CE to like 130-ish CE. And he probably wrote or said things that were written down middle of his life towards later. We know some of what he said because of the church historian Eusebius and what Eusebius said. I've already highlighted in one of my videos what Papias said about Mark. And so in the same paragraph, he talks about Mark and Matthew. What he says about Mark is he says that Mark was the traveling companion of the Apostle Peter. He was his interpreter. And that this John Mark that he talks about wrote down all of the things that he could remember that Peter told him. And so he goes on to say that that it wasn't in an ordered fashion, but it was just kind of, he wanted to get down as quickly as he could all of the things that he could remember about the stories that Peter told him about the gospel, about Jesus, all that kind of stuff. And so that's what he recalls about Mark and what Mark wrote down in his gospel. He goes on to talk about Matthew, and he says that Matthew wrote a sayings gospel, and that he wrote it in Hebrew. And so then he says that the people have translated it from there, and that's how we've gotten our Gospel of Matthew. But originally it was written in Hebrew, and it was a sayings gospel. And so Eusebius writes this in his church history, and he says this is how we've gotten Matthew and we've gotten Mark. Luke is said to have been Paul's traveling physician, someone who was close with Luke. We see that in the book of Acts. It seems like at some point it goes from third person to first person, or even second person, like a lot of we language. And so it's saying that at that point he picked up his time with Paul. And so he was a traveling companion with Paul. He knew Paul, and that's where he's getting a lot of his information from. Luke tells us from the beginning of his gospel that he's actually he's collecting sources. He's looked over a lot of this material, and he's actually going to use it or going to better it, because he says I'm going to set out to write a more ordered way of doing this. And so some scholars have said, well, maybe this was his way of saying that he's going to write a better ordered version than Mark did. Maybe he knew about what was going on with Mark. But the traditional thing says that Luke got his information from Paul, and Paul and Peter were in Rome preaching, and so Luke would have been aware of Mark, but Mark wrote because of Peter. Matthew wrote from his own eyewitness accounts, and so you have that going on. And then you have John, who John's going to write differently. He's an apostle of Jesus, and so he's going to write that. So you have two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John. This is the traditional view, Matthew and John. And then you have two people who were connected to apostles, but every single one of these has apostolic authority to them. And that's the church tradition. The church tradition hangs on to these, and the apostolic authority becomes really important going into like the second, third, fourth centuries, because other gospels start popping up, other heretical views on Christ start popping up, and so the church fathers are forced to kind of go, okay, which ones are canonical? And so they begin making lists of gospels that are canon versus the ones that aren't, and they kind of shelve some of these others. Some like for example, Marcion, he had a version of the Gospel of Luke that wasn't exactly Luke's, but that's the only one he accepted, and some others, and his list of canon wasn't exactly what everybody else had, and so they would dismiss some of his sayings because he didn't really know what he was talking about, kind of a deal is what they would posit it as, because of how he viewed the Old Testament and that kind of stuff. And so long process to make a canon. It didn't happen at Nicaea. Okay, I know that's out there, and people have been trying to do that ever since Dan Brown came out with the Da Vinci Code, and even before that, people were making those claims. But Nicaea had nothing to do with the canonization of the Bible. That was a long process that took a lot of different church fathers bringing forth their ideas of canon, and then finally coming together and the church stamping the official canon and saying, this is what we're going to accept and going forward. And it had more books in it than we have in our Protestant canon right now, but that's for a different story. We're talking about gospel formation. So early on, the reason that these four gained notoriety was because of apostolic authority. And so being attached to an apostle was so important. And this traditional view of apostolic authority in the four gospel tradition would last up until the 1800s. The whole idea of the tradition wouldn't even be challenged until the 1800s. And so it's held on for a really long time. Well, what ended up happening, so to switch gears, so that's the traditional view. To switch gears and to go into more of the critical views, what ended up happening was you had the Enlightenment happen. And you had the ability for the text of the scriptures to be printed. It's kind of a saying that before the Reformation happened, that the Bible was chained to the pulpit, and it was written in Latin, so people couldn't read it. And so they began translating it into German and finally into English. It began being mass produced once the printing press became available. And so the Protestant Reformation took over, and all this stuff began to happen. And then the Enlightenment happened, and the Enlightenment began challenging all kinds of things. We began, science started taking off, and then the idea of history and things like archaeology became important. And during that time period, it would lead up to the 1800s, and all of a sudden, the idea of using historical critical methodology in biblical studies to kind of see what's going on, we began to find, started taking off. So we began to find things, and we're digging in and like doing archaeology, and then we began to find new manuscripts. And see, up until this point, the 1700s, there was a tradition of manuscripts that was like kind of overriding. And this is the received text, the Textus Receptus. So there's really like three basic lanes when we come to the text of the New Testament. There's the Byzantine text, or the majority text. Then there is the the Textus Receptus, or the received text, and that is it really those two are kind of very similar, the majority text and the Textus Receptus. From what I gather, Erasmus, when he did his Textus Receptus, he was trying to take the best of all of his manuscripts and create a new one. And so maybe used parts of the majority text, but not all of it. But he created his own kind of lane and did his own thing. And so the Textus Receptus became the received text that was translated into German and translated into English. And what they would do is they would take these, especially the English Bibles, they would take these translated English New Testaments and then they would kind of just revise them. They wouldn't go back to the Greek. They wouldn't like retranslate them. What they would do is that they would revise them. They would, go back and revise, the Great Bible and then the Bishop's Bible. And then, so when you get to the 1600s, King James authorizes a group of scribes to go in and revise the Bishop's Bible and do a very conservative revision of the Bishop's Bible, and to use the Textus Receptus to make sure, because it's in that line, to make sure that it's what it's supposed to be. There's no footnotes, there's no like margin notes, none of that kind of stuff. And in 1611 they create the King James Authorized Version. And it is a revision of the Bishop's Bible, and it is from the Textus Receptus line. And that becomes like it's the Bible kind of a deal. Now the majority text is still out there. Other ones are still out there, but King James wants to put his stamp on the Bible, and so he does. And that became like the rule of the land for a long time. It wasn't until we began finding older manuscripts than the ones we had in the received tradition. And when we began finding those manuscripts, what we began understanding is that things were not quite the same. There were things that were different. There were things missing from the older manuscripts that were in the Textus Receptus, the received line, and even in the Byzantine line. And scholars began challenging that and began rethinking and going, wait a second, maybe there are things that have been added to these manuscripts over time that aren't in these early ones. And so you got things like the longer ending of Mark. It's not there in the earliest ones, but it's there in the received text line. And so scholars have had to wrestle with that and go, okay, what do we do with that? And so they bracket it off and they say it's not in the earliest ones in our English translations. And then part of John, John 8 isn't there. And then there's these other verses. And so in a good English translation, based upon the reconstruction of the New Testament, based upon earliest manuscript evidence that we found, in good translations, they will bracket off these ones that seem to be not there in the earliest ones. And they will completely omit ones that they can see, as we found different manuscripts in different pieces over time, where we can see scribal tradition growing, or we can see, we can see where the scribe inserted a verse here to help make sense here, or to smooth out some theological things here that they already knew, or maybe they were like, this should be here because they heard it somewhere else. We can see in the manuscript tradition scribal additions into it, so they take those out completely. They'll footnote and say, hey, it says this in other manuscripts, but they'll take them out of the text because we know they weren't there to begin with. The ones that we're not sure, like the longer ending of Mark, I was having a conversation with David De Silva, who's my New Testament professor, a New Testament theology professor, and we were talking about the ending of Mark, and he made the comment. He said, "I bet something was there." He said, because in the manuscripts that we see that there's space for something there, but the scribe didn't know what to put there, so it's blank. But it looks like there was space for something there because he knew something should have been there. And so he said, something probably should have been there to end it, because every other gospel ends differently. It's not as abrupt, but we don't have that in the earliest manuscripts, so it feels very abrupt. And so he was just commenting, so there was probably something there. It's probably not what grew into the tradition in the other manuscript tradition, but there was probably something there. John 8, the woman caught in adultery. It's not in the earliest manuscripts traditions, but there are some manuscripts who have spaces where it should be. And he was saying like, that it's probably something is there. because it doesn't make sense to go from there to there in the story. So something has to be there, but maybe it wasn't exactly that. Maybe that was a story that grew over time, or was a legend that they put in, because it's not in the earliest ones. So maybe that wasn't actually there to begin with, or maybe it was and it just went absent because that scribe didn't have that piece there or something. But so it's bracketed off. The ones that we know weren't there, that shouldn't be there, those are the ones that are taken out of the manuscript tradition. So all of this begins to be reconstructed. And part of that historical critical method of scholarship and reconstructing things and trying to go back into history and look and see what's there and how it came about is this idea of source criticism. And this idea of source criticism lends to this idea of Q, because what they began to see as they began to do comparative analysis of all these Gospels is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of things that line up, not just like coincidentally, not just like, oh, it's same story beats. These are like identical pieces, like word for word stuff in all three of them. And so what that lent to for scholars was for them to start thinking, wait a second, this looks like they had the same source, that they were copying from the same thing. Because this isn't just like coincidentally they all came up with the same thing. Like, this doesn't happen like this. In fact, what it looks like is if you were a professor and you had students handing in papers, and then if they were this close, you would say, oh, someone's copying off of somebody else. And so that's the thinking that starts happening is, wait a second, one of these probably was first, and then the other ones, came from there. In tradition, Matthew was always seen as first, the first gospel that was written, and then Mark, then Luke, then John at the end. As they began to look at it, though, they began to realize something as they put their methods in place. They were like, wait a second, it seems that maybe Mark was actually first. That Mark is the shorter gospel. It's the one that has the least amount of added information to it. And it seems like that's the one that's being utilized in the other ones without any addition to it. And so that's how Markan priority becomes a thing. There's other reasons for it too, but that's one of the main ones. And it doesn't seem like that it's the one that's smoothing out stuff. It's the one that's more rough and has a little bit more edge to it. And so Markan priority becomes a thing. The Mark was the first one that was written. And then they have to figure out, okay, so where then, if Mark was the one that was utilized by Matthew and Luke, John's its own thing. We'll leave that over the side here. But if Mark was the one that was utilized by Matthew and Luke, where did all the extra stuff come from? And knowing what Papias said about Matthew's sayings gospel caused scholars to think about that and go, wait a second, maybe Mark is a source, and that this sayings gospel thing that's out there is another source, and that maybe what's going on here is that Matthew and Luke are using Mark and using this saying source together to create their gospels. And then Luke is like expounding on oral tradition and that kind of stuff later on. And so now you have what's called two-source theory, they would call this the Q theory, which we'd have, you'd have Mark as a source, and then you'd have this extra saying source that they would call Q, which is the first letter of the German word Quelle, which means source. Okay, so that's what they would say. They would say Mark is a first source, and then you have this secondary source called Q, and that's how these two gospels would have been formed, Matthew and Luke. Then Matthew would kind of expound upon it, and then whoever the author of Luke was would also expound upon it with oral tradition and that kind of stuff. And then you also have people who would push back against that, say, okay, well, it's more than that. It can't just be that. So they would have three-source theory, which is, Mark in priority, Q, a sayings gospel, and then another source to add in to help build Luke out a little more. Then you even have four-source theory. And four-source theory is Mark, that's being utilized by Matthew, and then other Matthean sources, and Q. And then you have Mark being utilized by Luke, and then Matthew is being utilized by Luke, and then Q is being utilized by Luke, and then other Lucan sources. All kinds of stuff going on here in four-source theory. And so the Q though became the dominant reality for like since like 1830s all the way up until even to today. It's the dominant view of how gospel formation happens. Well, a guy named Farrer comes along and he challenges Q and he says, I don't think that's what it is. I think what it is that what you have is you have Mark going first. You have Matthew utilizing Mark and adding to it with oral tradition. And then what you have is you have Luke using Matthew and Mark and some oral tradition and creating their own thing and going more with Matthew even than Mark. And that was Farrer's position. Mark Goodacre, comes along in 2002 and writes this book, The Case Against Q, after being, in this world doing research on it. I think he did his dissertation in synoptic problem and all this kind of stuff. And he has been talking about this for 23 years about the fact that we don't need Q at all. This whole idea of a sayings Q gospel thing that's out there, that's not it. We don't need that. And he argues for even a more nuanced position than Farrer, but he argues that it's what Farrer is talking about here. It's a Mark in priority, that Matthew used Mark and some sayings stuff, but it's mostly oral tradition things that he knew about. And then it was Luke kind of using Matthew and Mark to refine his version of the gospel. And he was going to add some things to it based on oral tradition that he knew. And some of it is even based on what he knew about, different, he was a Paul, like he liked Paul's stuff. And so he's trying to pull in some stuff here and there. And there's a lot of theory into that. And so that's Goodacre's case. It's like we don't need to have a Q. We don't need to have an extra outside source. That Luke is just kind of utilizing Matthew, and all of that is interesting. There's a lot of case to be made for that. Now I'll kind of tell you what I'm thinking and where I kind of land in this. I land somewhere in the middle between the Q source and what Goodacre is saying. I really agree a lot with what Goodacre is saying, as he's talking about Luke utilizing Matthew. And the more I dive into this, the more I see it. The more I look at Matthew and I watch how Luke and Matthew interact with each other, I'm going, wait a second. It seems a lot more like Luke is taking Matthew's stuff, agreeing with it for the most part, except he knows a few more things to edit Matthew's stuff. Like he's like, I don't fully agree with how Matthew did this here. I want to change it here for a different audience, kind of a deal. Where I would depart from Goodacre and Farrer is I think what we see in Matthew is I think we see him utilizing Mark as his primary source. And I'm going to go on out on a limb and say that this whole idea that Papias brought up of Matthew having a sayings gospel in Hebrew. Here's what I think happened. I think that Matthew, the actual Matthew, wrote a sayings gospel in Hebrew. I think he quotes the Hebrew Bible in it. I think whoever compiled Matthew into what we have today in Greek took Mark and took Matthew's Hebrew sayings gospel and translated it into Greek and then brought the two together. And then instead of using the Hebrew Bible references, took the Septuagint references and utilized them. I think that is more of what we're seeing here. Because I think the tradition in the church was to use the Septuagint, not to use the Hebrew Bible. And so I think what we see in what we have for a final form in Matthew looks a lot more like what the proponents of Q would say, is that we would have a Mark source and we would have a sayings gospel that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, translated into Greek using the Septuagint source. And then we would have some different things that the compiler of Matthew is what I would call it, argued for. That way, I mean, I don't think it goes against the tradition. I just don't think what Papias is saying about the Gospel of Matthew is what we actually see and what we have right now in the Greek copy of Matthew. I think it's something different. And I think that whoever put it together wanted to keep the tradition of Matthew alive, but also wanted to utilize what Mark had that Matthew didn't have. And so putting all of that together. And I think Luke comes along and goes, I want to keep that tradition alive of what's going on with Matthew, but I also have a copy of Mark in front of me, and I want to edit some of this, but I also have extra sources. And so I'm going to pull some of these oral traditions and extra sources that we have, some of the things that I know from Pauline literature and that kind of stuff. We're going to edit all this together, and I'm going to put together a more orderly version of this. And so I think that's what we see in Luke. John is his own thing. I think he's utilizing what he knows from the Synoptics. And Goodacre talks about this in his book too. I think John's taking what he knows from the Synoptics, but he has a different order. He has a different way he wants to compile all this, because his point is not to provide a historical accurate event or thing of what's going on in his own, idea of what history and biography is. I think he wants to put forward, whoever, wrote John, if it was the Apostle John or not, that's not fully clear in the scholarship today, but it is the tradition. But I think whoever wrote John wants to put forth an argument to say, this is why you should believe in Jesus. This is the spiritual aspect of our lives that connects us to Christ, and this is who Christ was, and this is why you should believe in him. Not this is the history of what happened kind of a deal. Luke is trying to do more ancient biography, that kind of stuff, based on the tradition of Mark and Matthew and that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I land on all of this. Somewhere kind of in between, but I fully agree with Goodacre that it looks like Luke is not utilizing Q so much as he's utilizing Matthew and then comparing it with Mark and kind of pulling all the best of all of it together. I like I said this in one of my last videos. Mark reads like your 13, your 14-year-old is telling you a story. Matthew reads like someone heard that story and wants to blog about it to their audience. And they have extra sources and they have extra information because they heard from somebody else too. And Luke looks like he's doing a research paper, that he just is pulling together all these sources and all the things that he's got in front of him. And he's utilizing them in the best way that he wants to lay it out possible in a more orderly kind of way. And so that's kind of how I do it. And then John's over here having a seance or something. I don't know. It's more spiritual. I love this picture I saw of golfer John Daly, and comparing all the rest of the golfers, the straight-laced ones, to the Synoptics, and here's John Daly as the Gospel of John. Anyway, hopefully this was beneficial for you as you're thinking about this. If you're someone who falls in the traditional camp and you want to keep that way, that's totally fine. I mean, that was the way that the church viewed it for like 1700 years. I wouldn't fall in that camp. I would fall more in some of the critical reconstruction ideas of this, based upon what we've found and what we know to be true. But there's argument to be made for all of this, and I think that at the end of the day, we have the Gospels that we have, and we have the stories of Jesus that survive, and I think that all of them are awesome, and I love all of them for their each individual quirkiness. And I think that's where I'm going to stop and what I'm going to say on that. So anyway, like, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.